Good morning, everyone. My name is Eli Clemens. I'm a policy analyst here at ITIF Center for Data Innovation. We're here today to talk about a very important topic, which is how to improve workplaces using data and technology. The last decade has seen an explosion of new technologies that can make workplaces safer, healthier, and provide a better experience for the workers that are in those workplaces. These include things like wearable sensors that can detect fatigue to AI tools that prevent injuries before they happen. However, policy has not kept up with the development of these technologies and indeed is woefully behind. Most discussions about workplace technology and even the future of work have revolved largely around privacy concerns and surveillance concerns. Without discounting these concerns, this is an issue because adoption in the private sector of a lot of these potential technologies is very much lagging behind. The technologies are largely in large manufacturers and confined to them, while a lot of US workplaces remain relatively analog. I recently published a report entitled How Data-Rich Workplaces Can Improve Worker Safety, Health, and Experience. This report attempts to broaden the discussion on this topic by looking at positive use cases of these technologies and how government can accelerate the development, testing, and adoption of these technologies. Without downplaying the legitimate concerns around privacy and surveillance, the report also shows how policymakers can develop positive use cases of these technologies while also mitigating negative ones. So to discuss this topic today, we have a great set of panelists who have spent their careers developing or commercializing these technologies, in addition to regulating the workplace and government, or focus more on the worker perspective in this debate. These panelists include Heather McDougall, the owner of McDougall Solutions, LLC, Tom West, Vice President and Global Practice Leader at MakeYouSafe, Christina Yancey, the Vice President of Employment and Economic Opportunity at American Institutes for Research, and finally, Ashish Banerjee, Associate Professor of Industrial and Systems Engineering and Mechanical Engineering at University of Washington. So let's get started. The discussion is going to cover three topics. First, to discuss some of these technologies more in depth. Second, consider the worker perspective within this debate. And then finally, looking at what policymakers should do. For the audience, just a note to please submit any questions during the webinar to Slido. We will have some time at the end to discuss your questions. So let's dive right in. Ashish, let's begin with you. You have researched ergonomic risk modeling and sensor-based data to protect workers from injury. How can these technologies move from the research labs, which you're involved in, to the factory floor and actually be implemented? And what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, great question to kick off the conversation. So one of the key things is like that sometimes doesn't get considered as much during the technology development phases, to make sure that you're actually talking to or working with the end users while you're developing the technology. So all of these are based on pretty state-of-the-art AI and machine learning techniques, and there are lots of advances on those. But the trick is to make sure that we put them into a form that can be used on a day-to-day basis by the workers in those workplaces. So specifically what we ended up doing is we ran some user studies where we were able to get some workers from a partner manufacturing company to come and like use these sensors like vision cameras and other variables and help us kind of validate like how good the technology is, and also give us feedback on what might be the end use form that if it is given to them in that way, it's gonna be more useful. So we ended up essentially distilling everything into the form of an easy to use app that they can like download and use it from their smartphones, which I think can go a long way in like making sure it gets used.
Great. Thanks, Ashish. So moving from, you talked a little bit about the development of these technologies. Let's think more about the commercialization of these. And so we have Tom West here at MakeYouSafe. Tom, you've seen at MakeYouSafe how data-driven safety metrics, which the company focuses on, can move companies from lagging to leading indicators. So can you explain this a little bit? Maybe also talking about the technology, and then looking at, how can these leading KPIs help improve workplace safety?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Eli. Nice to be with you all. The origin story of our company is really illustrative. Our CEO, about 10 years ago, went to visit his dad to take him out to lunch. And his dad was working as a director of safety for a company responsible for about 2,000 employees. And it was a bad day for dad. Because a regulatory agency was there to investigate a hearing loss claim, which was found not to be the case. But our CEO, Gabe Glenn, started to ask an awful lot of really good questions that day, right? Why do we wait for injuries and incidents to occur before we start investigating root causes? And we're here in the Midwest. Why can't we predict incidents and injuries and prevent them, give advanced warning, just like we do with tornadoes, at the beginning of the week? So that led to the creation of Make You Safe about 9.5 years ago. And you may see my fashion accessory here. We're a multi-function sensor-based wearable technology that gathers indicators of potential hazards and risk, and in real time provides that safety intelligence, or that data evidence, to safety leaders so that they better understand where to focus their efforts, where to mitigate risk, where to implement corrective actions before people get hurt. One of the benefits of being here in the Midwest, in Des Moines, Iowa, is that we're the number one or number two insurance capital of the country. So just as Ashish was saying early on, we had the luxury of working with work comp insurers and carriers and agents and brokers, and their industrial hygienists and their ergonomists and their loss control professionals, finding out about what type of data and what format would be actionable and useful, and also similarly what not to do. So since then, we've been scaling up an innovative tech company. I'm happy to say that we're being used around the world on multiple continents every day. Thousands of workers at scores of companies check out a Make You Safe device and wear it sort of as smart PPE. And the impact is significant. The transformational shift that organizations have been able to make to go from lagging in metrics about what incidents occurred, who experienced them when, right, days away from work, instead to number of indicators gathered, potential trends and patterns that are recognized within a facility. And what we've seen is really significant. Organizations that have significantly reduced incidents and claims. Organizations that have eliminated strain and exertion incidents, and sustained that for multiple years. The impact of fostering an environment where workers are encouraged to report things from the front lines in real time, because safety leaders can't be everywhere. They can't see everything. So we've certainly seen conservatively a 50 to 90% reduction in the first 12 months in incidents and costs and claims, frequency and severity. And I'll pause there, but the evidence, the impact is real. Technologies exist right now, and with the right approach, they can be easy to implement. Doesn't need to be extraordinarily difficult.
Tom, thanks so much for that answer, and apologies to the audience. I was having some technical difficulties, but we're back now. So Heather, would like to jump to you now, building on Tom's point there. Could you speak a little bit, and maybe you rely on your experience in government as a regulator, looking at the question of there's so many proven technologies out there, and yet adoption has been relatively slow. What are some of the biggest challenges to increasing that deployment? Is it a cost issue? Is it a culture issue? Is it one of these narratives around surveillance, privacy, or is it other factors?
Heather, you may be on mute.
Heather, still unable to hear you, so let's get that figured out. In the meantime, let's jump back to Ashish. Oh, I think we can hear you now, maybe, Heather.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, somehow I must have hit the mute button on my microphone.
No worries. We're getting all the
Apologize for that.
technological
I
difficulties
know. Let's get those out of the
here.
way and no more for anyone.
Yeah.
All right, so let me go back. I mean, I think what I was saying so eloquently is that the biggest barrier isn't the technology itself. It's the environment in which the technology is deployed into. So I think there's things that companies can do to help with those issues. So first, I would say highlight, the culture and trust. If workers think that the technology tool is about surveillance or discipline, then adoption is going to be challenged before it starts. So even if the intent is safety, the perception of workers can be different. So organizations that succeed bring workers into this process early. They explain the why, and they set clear boundaries on data use. So I think the second would be integration and operation friction. So, a lot of companies are still managing safety with spreadsheets or legacy systems. So adding a new digital tool can feel overwhelming, another dashboard, another workflow, another thing they have to do and learn. So if technology doesn't integrate cleanly into their operations and their existing systems, it's challenging to move past that pilot. And then third, I would say, is the ROI story. It's not always about cost. There needs to be this confidence, and leaders need to understand the why. Will this reduce risk, injuries? Is it going to be reliable? Is it going to improve efficiency? Will it scale across our operations that have many sites and are global? So when the value proposition isn't clear, that's when investment slows. So EHS and operations leaders really need to understand how to present the narrative, including around data, the right amount, and provide a compelling story. And then finally, address the bandwidth, because EHS teams, operations teams, they are stretched thin. So technology requires change management, training, communication, and sustained leadership support. So without that, adoption stalls even when the technology is promising. So the real bottleneck, again, isn't the technology, the innovation, it's dealing with trust, integration. So the companies that move the fastest are ones that treat technology adoption as change management effort, not a procurement decision.
Great. Thanks for that, Heather. Let's pivot now to Christina, who's done quite a bit of work on thinking about the adoption question. Christina, if you'd like to either respond to or add to Heather's point there.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. Hi, everyone. I come from American Institutes for Research, where we do research and technical assistance to help with understanding new evidence and applying that related to AI and other innovations for workers and learners. And I just wanted to add on to kind of Heather's points and kind of add a little bit of nuance to that, which, I think one of the things that's really important is that a lot of the narrative around the value of AI right now is on productivity. And productivity gets conflated with the idea of quantity of increased kind of products. And the narrative needs to also include quality, because that's where workers really come into being, I think, more explicitly brought into the room when we discuss that there's an interest to make sure that we're not just trying to get more for less or have just an increase in the net of some kind of widget, but that there's an interest in improving and making progress in the development of quality. And that really gets to leaders sharing in goals that include a sense of progress that workers can attach to. I think, so that gets to Heather's point about having there be a why that's clearly articulated and creates a shared vision that workers can get behind. I also think it's really important to emphasize that when we're rolling out these technologies, that adults are learners the same as we are when we're in K through 12 or in post-secondary. And there's ways to understand how adults learn differently from, for example, children. And so, there's lots of science about this, but I would just emphasize a couple of key points that adults have a lot of experience. And it's important to think about this technology in the space of integrating that within their own experience, that they're experts within the organizations, and to impose this as though there isn't kind of an existing, not only like Heather said, culture, but also just experience and expertise that this has to be kind of integrated into, and that adults often are motivated by understanding why, and that there's a need to help them appreciate having an intrinsic learning motivation. And often that also needs to be wrapped up around some kind of problem solving, that there's an understanding of there's solutions, and this engagement in this experience is going to both be something that their motivation, the why, helping them have some element of self-control, that there's some part that they can self-direct within. That is also just important to just adoption of any kind of something new that's innovative, and AI and technologies and are no different. So I think it's just important to emphasize that we know a lot about how to bring adults into adoption of new experiences and new innovations, but we really need to also make sure that we're adapting how adults learn into the equation of that adoption process.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Yeah, definitely important to think about the implementation of these technologies, and maybe that's a part that isn't always thought fully enough by policymakers. Another part of the equation is also factoring in the worker perspective, either from a learning perspective or thinking about how workers are different in the design stage. So Ashish, maybe going to you to continue on this thread, when you're designing these technologies or thinking about it, how are you factoring in how maybe workers are different, either if they maybe need more learning, like Christine was talking about, or also thinking about not just safety, but also accessibility, perhaps for aging or differently abled individuals in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great point. First of all, I'd like to reiterate a couple of things that Heather and Christina already pointed out, that we also saw during our technology development phase, when we brought in people from those organizations to help us get data or validate some of our initial solutions, that a lot of the existing solutions still happen on paper and at least ergonomics, or at best on some spreadsheets on some central server. So there is, and resources are stretched thin, so people are looking for solutions, especially at the individual worker level. And that's what one of the things we realized, that more we can convey this message that this is something that's very easy to use, this is something that you might be able to use on your own to do monitoring for your day-to-day safety improvement, and long-term reduction of health risks, a better chance we have of getting them adopted in large scale or deployed in the organization. So coming back to the accessibility issue, or making sure that whatever technology we develop is useful, meaningful, and accessible to the broad cohort of people, individuals working in any organization. I think there are two key aspects to it, and I know some people are working on those, but it's not always very evident from many of the AI solutions that we see out there. So one of the key things is in the final form, how accessible is it? Like if I'm using a smartphone app and I'm a differently abled individual, like I need some additional options to make it easier for me to be able to use it. So often those design considerations from a final usability standpoint are not factored in, and some they are probably added on at the end just to with some buttons maybe to make it sort of usable, but that's not the way to go about it. That should come into from the initial design stage itself of prototyping the solution. So that's one part of it, and the other is the probably even bigger factor is the data. So if you are building all your AI and machine learning models trained on data that's has never seen these certain groups of individuals who are either differently abled or maybe are more aged, have some already maybe the decline in some of their skills, or maybe they have additional experience which your cohort of people on whom you have based your solutions on, they don't have that experience. They can do maybe things faster in some ways, but they lack that experience. So if so, your how representative your training is, data set is, based on which your solutions are built, is as important, if not even more important, to make sure that these solutions are really meaningful for everyone in the organization. So those are a couple of things I'd like to reiterate as very important as we go forward.
Great. Thanks, Ashish. And that's a great segue into a question for Tom here. Also thinking about how these technologies can make a real impact. So Tom, how do you determine if a new workplace technology actually can make a real impact on, say, worker safety or worker health, rather than just putting in another feature that adds a dashboard and doesn't maybe have actual effect or impact?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I want to go back to something that Heather said a moment ago, which is adoption is incredibly low. We've been at this for a decade. All of the research, I think, that I have seen, surveys in national and international associations, research entities, really all shows the same thing, that the vast majority of respondents typically understand that safety technologies exist. The majority of them think that it may make a difference here, but the number of organizations that have actually implemented technologies aside from safety and health software is dismally low. And I completely agree that that has an awful lot to do with the culture that's created, the willingness to manage change and introduce an innovation and communicate the why. So I agree with a lot of those comments that Heather made, and others also said this has got to be easy. And the word surveillance came up, right? That's an initial perception. And I think that leading organizations find business value in the health and safety of workers and want to live that value and communicate that, and are seeking tools and data that can help them achieve that. So your question, Eli, starting with the why, right? What are we trying to solve? Organizations that are asking themselves, what issues do we have? And I'm a vendor, for gosh sake. I hear every day, well, are we going to take your word for it as a vendor? Can we, interesting companies that are willing to engage in the conversation will ask to talk to clients of ours or to see case studies. And now we have an awful lot of those things. So engaging with vendors, I think, and that certainly helps us learn. We're very interested to have conversations about what problems you're trying to solve and, how work is done in reality right now and what business processes are most important and how those things can be impacted by, a transparent discussion about what data we provide, how that is being used, and the impact that it can have. When you see, that data evidence, let me also insert this. Ashish made comments about AI and use of data, right? We've all heard the old axiom, garbage in, garbage out. And AI is very much the same way, right? Data is siloed within organizations. We've been putting sensors on things, on machines for years, and yet that rarely is paying off. So within a couple of hours of implementation of our tool, what we've seen is the immediate actionability of data for operations leaders and for toward the health and safety of workers, toward understanding how to eliminate inefficiencies and optimize processes to create business value, and also make work safer for employees by eliminating hazards altogether. And we certainly have an awful lot of data evidence about how organizations are doing that. I'll comment about this. One of the unique things that we do on our wearable device is enable push-to-talk voice communication from the frontline worker. So it has to be intentional, but a worker can push a button and report things via voice without stopping their work or remembering to have to tell somebody. And the number of things that our clients hear on a daily basis that start with, I've been meaning to tell somebody for a long time, or we have this issue, right? Here's solutions that we've thought about in our department, is astounding. And to have an organization that values that information, wants to do something about it, and reinforces positively that reporting behavior, that part of their culture, safety becomes a lived value throughout the organization. And within 60 to 90 days, we've seen a 10x increase in those reports from the front lines of near misses or good catches or close calls, or just observations from the frontline workers' point of view that have real impact on operational productivity, on health and safety, on quality, and on culture. So if that is helpful, it's something that we certainly have seen. Sensor data provides a real understanding of the context of how work is being done. Being able to immediately visualize and push notifications to safety leaders or operations leaders about what's happening in their facility right now, or where there are hotspots of an increased number of hazard indicators. All of that, along with that frontline reporting behavior, really can have a significant impact and almost immediate results for organizations.
Great. Thanks, Tom. That gives a really good insight into how some of these workplace technologies can be both practical, but also human-centric. Switching the conversation a little bit from the technology to the worker perspective, and Tom, you already kind of started to do this. Let's go to Christina now. And Christina, you've done a lot of work on how emerging workplace technology can either widen or close different gaps in the workforce, whether it's equity, skill gaps, so on. So when employers introduce new workplace technologies, what are some of the most overlooked design or deployment choices that determine whether these technologies will ultimately be successful?
That's a great question, Eli, and I am interested to hear what the other panelists think about this as well, in terms of highlighting just one thing or a couple of things that seem to be really kind of important and perhaps missing. There's two things that I think about. One of them is that, AI is a neutral tool, right? It doesn't inherently make things better or worse. It's about how it's applied. It's about the intersection of the people that are applying it in a particular context and environment. So what that means is that when these tools are introduced, it's important to present them in a balanced way about how they're being implemented in a way that brings, as Tom had mentioned, transparency, and that there's an open discussion about the risk mitigations and considerations, because without presenting the balance of the benefits and potential risks, then it doesn't create like enough trust or safety concerns for the workers or the staff, that it feels like that there's something that's being imposed without a discussion around the balance of both the kind of goals and benefits of these tools, but also understanding the feedback, so that there's always a process of continuous improvement and learning. So to that regard, I would also emphasize the importance of piloting products in the real world. There's prototyping in a lab, that's one thing, but then when you bring it into the real world, we know that as much as AI has the promise of reducing burden, any process of learning involves some kind of what we call friction. If there isn't any friction and something is 100% seamless, there's no learning that's being involved, because learning is just involves challenge, and you have to build in a process of enabling that learning so that there's a safety in piloting something, improving it, and ensuring that there's an opportunity to provide that kind of feedback loop. So I think, to kind of summarize this, bringing in some transparency, discussing a balanced understanding of the potential benefits and potential risks of integrating something, and then also creating an environment where there's real world testing, and that there's feedback between those that are implementing the technology and those that have kind of the decision making around its application is really important.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Ashish, I know you would like to respond to this point, and then if any other panelists would.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate something that resonated very much with, so reiterate something that Christine just now pointed out. This is trying out a solution in practice before you go to maybe full-scale deployment. And that's something which is often not done well or not done at all. And that's one of the many contributing factors to maybe the lack of widespread adoption that we see these days. So one of the things that we did on a small scale, because we are developing this technology in a research lab, as she pointed out, and but we had thankfully, the connection with a large manufacturing organization from where we had the workers come in who helped us build the solution or get the right kind of data in the first place. But also the other thing that we did was once we had the first kind of version or iteration of our solution, so we kind of got most of those same people not back in the lab, but we handed off the first prototype to them to see and test it out in practice. Now, we didn't manage to get the full cohort, but there were some changes in the personnel, but mostly the same group of people. And then they could give us actual meaningful feedback on what are the real world constraints and challenges that we absolutely should have considered and didn't, or how user friendly it would be for them to do it on a daily basis, while not providing to be a major stumbling block in their like regular operations. So that like insights or that feedback was really helpful as we developed the like second like version of it. So that's a really important point.
Great, thanks, Ashish. Yeah, one example I have in the report is looking at the design and implementation question. If there's some sort of monitoring on, say, long distance trucker, there can be very beneficial technologies that can monitor if their eyelids start to droop, and maybe there needs to be an alarm for the trucker to pull off to rest stop so there's no accident. But another example might be something monitoring, say, the speed of the truck, and if it suddenly halts. Well, in some cases, you might want a truck to suddenly halt if a deer jumps into the highway. And so, if something like that were happening and there was some performance evaluation built into that technology, there would want to be a design exception for, say, a legitimate reason why you might want to suddenly slam on the brakes. So there's a lot of different examples, and of course, we can talk more about that. But another frequently discussed topic in this debate about the worker perspective is the surveillance topic. And so, Heather, I'd like to go to you now and ask, in thinking about worker privacy, are there ways that we can frame it in positive outcomes for workers rather than just focus solely on the surveillance concerns? Is there a legitimate use case where there could be electronic monitoring for fired or hazard risk, and so you might need to have a camera in a workplace environment, but what are the red lines, and how can that not turn into surveillance or not be always framed as surveillance?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because that's an issue that comes up a lot. So I'm going to continue on the thread that was started by Tom and then carried on here in the last few minutes. I think when workers see technology as something done for them and not to them, that helps start the conversation from a good place. And then I think the shift really has to be, what is the worker gaining, rather than, what is the company collecting? So start from those positive outcomes. Modern safety technology reduces risk, especially around really important things like serious incidents and fatalities. So how can we address that? How can we reduce physical strain? How can we get faster responses when there are questions or when there are issues? So if we lead with this tool helps ensure that you go home safely every day, that resonates with workers a lot more than talking about the data that's going to be collected. But when it comes to that data, you need to anchor privacy and data collection in transparency. They need to understand clearly, what is the data that is being collected? What is not being collected? How long is it kept? And how will it never be used? Because I think oftentimes there's a misunderstanding from workers on how the data will be used. But when people know those boundaries, they're far more comfortable in seeing the benefits that you have already laid out. And third, highlight how these tools are really elevating the worker voice. And Tom touched on this. There's tools around instant voice-enabled good observation programs, predictive analytics, near-miss data, sensor insights that often surface risk that frontline workers have been raising. And now it's in data that is being elevated to leadership. So technology can actually amplify worker voice and their concerns, and then also hold leaders accountable. So finally, again, I would say the goal isn't here to track workers. It is to remove them from dangerous situations, to reduce the burden of manual reporting, to identify hazards before they cause harm. So if workers see this as something that's not looking to blame them, they're actually looking to reduce blame and increase safety, I think that's when you've got that partnership that really helps with deployment and acceptance of these technologies.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Tom, would you like to add on to that point? Because I know you've done a lot of thinking about the data question that Heather touched on here.
Yeah, sure. And if you don't mind, I'll start with something you and I have talked about, Eli, when we visited. You mentioned earlier technology can be human centric, and privacy has come up. You know, the perception of surveillance. You know, our approach and our philosophical decisions, strategic decisions in developing technology have led us to create a solution that first and foremost doesn't collect any PII. Right, there are no sensors looking at the worker. Instead, we're looking outward for experiences and exposures in real time, and we're trying to facilitate that frontline, communication behavior. We're not, impeding or annoying or intruding upon the worker in any way. There's no buzzers and bells and whistles that are constantly going off that you have to interpret, right? It doesn't get in the way of work. In fact, we suggest for the front lines, it should be viewed as smart PPE that collects data to make a safer workplace. And a quick story that I think is really illustrative. I walked into a very large data center project on a construction site where the general contractor was implementing us to a frontline workers, and these are multi-employer job sites, lots of subcontractors and lots of different, organizational safety leaders, and very fast moving, very high paced, very hazardous. And in the back of the lunch tent, when I got there early, I saw something that reinforced for me that this was going to work extremely well. Just a large rolling cork board with a piece of duct tape down the middle. And on one side, there was an index card that said things you told us about. And on the other side said what we're doing to fix them, right? Technology simply can do that for organizations and automate the process. With the right approach, we can easily overcome these privacy issues, which are very real. We can make it easy to implement. We can make data immediately actionable and easy to understand. You don't need a room full of data scientists with the right approach, but yet it needs to be introduced and championed and communicated, and everybody's got to go from pilot to thinking about larger deployments. So hopefully that's a little bit of a helpful illustrative story.
Yeah, definitely. Getting back to the feedback loop between workers who are actually using these technologies and the managers who are implementing them and the technologists who are designing them. We have an audience question. How do the challenges around adopting workplace safety technologies differ across industry sectors? So let's hear from Christina and Ashish on this audience question.
It's an excellent question. I wanted to emphasize 2 points. One of them is that across sectors and industries, we can say there's broadly an element that's the same, which is to have a framework around the adoption of these new technologies that balances innovation and risk. And that across all of the industries, we have to be explicit about risk, specifically around ethics and security and safety. So, and what I mean by that is the safety and security of the data in particular. And as Heather had pointed out about how information is being used, as we've been discussing about these concerns around the risks with surveillance. And I think that then when we come to the innovation piece, that's where we see a lot of the context and variation across sectors. I think a good example of that is around video technologies. So how a video camera is installed into a workplace is very different based upon the context of a particular industry. And then even within an industry, there are ways that you can apply the security frameworks to help support workers in appreciating that context. I can give you an example. At AIR, we work a lot with teachers and educators to help with skilling teachers as well as individuals that are preparing for new jobs. And we have a project that is, it's called the Classroom Automated Feedback Environment, and it involves us videotaping teachers proctoring lessons. Now, you can imagine under some circumstances, having a video monitoring you in the middle of your performance at work could involve a lot of threats to your understanding of how that information is going to be used. But it's important that in the context of applying this video technology, there's been these communicated guardrails around the use of those information and data, which is to help inform teachers around their own professional development, that we ensure that the data that's being used for this is not shared outside of the system, and that that the teachers has access to this information, and that we're using it to help with their own professional development, and that it isn't explicitly a part of any amount of performance assessment. Now, obviously, in other environments and other contexts, it's actually important for the video technologies to actually be applied in a way that is useful for other workplace considerations. But I think it's helpful to think of a specific technology, and depending on the industry and the context, that you can set up different understandings of how the data are being used, and also around how there are certain conditions where it's really critically important to make sure, if you want to make sure that there's an honest feedback loop, that that information is kept within a closer network. So those are just a couple of examples, but I know that we can talk about many where we can see that depending on the different industry, that a particular technology will have a different implication and benefit and risk.
Yeah, just wanted to add a couple of things. Like video technology, or like use of video cameras, is like probably the most common form of sensors that we still use for all kinds of monitoring, including safety. And they are like, I see like kind of a broad use across all kinds of industry segments. Like you have the sort of the indoor operations in warehouses, manufacturing plants, as well as like outdoors, more in the construction sector, like even other kinds of mining and other field operations. So that's pretty like widely used, and it's kind of important to delineate like what is being stored and how it's being used and what is being used for. One thing that does vary from industry to industry is actually depends on like the size and scale of the operations. So if we are talking about like small scale retailers or small or medium scale enterprises versus like large organizations, whether it's indoor, outdoors, they are like because of the sheer gap in the resources and also maybe the appetite for adoption of new technology, we see quite a big change. So one thing that we found out through our experience of like user studies and working with a few different organizations, that if we have to talk about bringing in some of the safety AI-driven safety tools, we need to kind of even more closely target like individuals in these smaller organizations, and really kind of hone in on the point that this is something as simple as they can use it on their own. It doesn't like require much of extra practice or training. It's definitely not going to add anything significantly to your daily operations. Whereas in the more of the larger organizations, it can kind of flow in more through like the higher level organizational teams who can like push for the benefits of the use of some technology. So just something to keep in mind depending on the size and scale of the organization.
Great. More good things to consider there, Ashish. We're running out of time a little bit, so I want to move to policy. But before we do that, we have another question from the audience. For smaller firms with limited budgets, what are realistic steps to begin adopting workplace safety data tools? Do any of the panelists have a response to this question?
I think I have a quick one.
Yes,
I mean,
After
Heather,
you want me to-
you start.
I would say start small. Like a lot of times employers get overwhelmed and they think there's all of these tools out there, we should be using them. I would start with the question of what is a problem that you want to solve, and then try and identify a technology solution to address it. Pilot it before you go bigger. But again, start small, both in terms of the solution and the scope.
Yeah, and I'd completely agree with that. With regard to budget, because we get this question all the time, hopefully you don't mind me being a little forthright. You know, there are exoskeletons that are available for a few $100s now that can help eliminate strain and exertion. You know, in our case, I say all the time, we're less costly than work gloves. Right? Technology is available and accessible and can really have a dramatic impact, but you've got to start somewhere. So engage with experts, with vendors. With me, I spend a lot of my time taking those calls and educating and informing, and I've just written a book about this. You know, the biggest concern for us in finding a good fit client is, do they have the kind of culture where they can introduce this idea, or is there a willingness to communicate it? And then, because we make it easy to begin gaining insights and optics into where risk and hazards lie, is there a willingness to do something about it? Right? Not hold workers accountable with this data, but instead share it, communicate it, and make change to the business.
Great. So some practical advice there. So I want to switch the conversation now to policy, because we've heard, you know, over the last 50 minutes that, you know, a lot of the positive use cases of these technologies, you know, some ways smaller firms can implement them, how managers and technologists thinking about these technologies can pivot them and ask the right questions and make sure that they're getting positive use cases. But as I mentioned at the beginning, policy has really remained behind. And so, Heather, I'd like to start with you. You've done some recent writing on how different regulators have not kept pace with modern workplace realities. Where should the federal government go in order to keep pace with the workplace realities, but also the technological development of a lot of these workplace technologies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. And I guess I would start answering it from the federal government as a whole. You know, what can the federal government, what can the administration do to really encourage innovation? And I was thinking about this in the last couple of weeks because there's an office called OIRA, which is in OMB in the White House, and they came out with a memo on deregulation. And it really shortened the time frame for deregulation. You know, that's part of the Trump administration agenda. And I started thinking about, like, how can the administration really do something similar when it comes to technology innovation? So how can they encourage regulation on a faster timeline? So that's one place I would start, is look at ways to really be a catalyst for regulation around technology to really enhance the ability to do that. And then that will trickle down to agencies like OSHA. And I would say with OSHA, you know, OSHA has really become the floor, not the ceiling, of what health and safety performance looks like today. You know, for most employers, compliance with the standards is no longer the goal. It's that starting point. You know, they were written decades ago, and today companies have much more complex operations, all these new technologies, and global expectations around supply chain integrity, worker well-being. So how does OSHA become part of this evolution? How do they become a seat at the table? You know, because industry is really building the rest of the house when we talk about OSHA now being this floor. So how can OSHA create a more innovation-friendly environment? And I think that, you know, part of that is having that seat at the table, taking a shift in its posture from not just compliance, but anchoring everything in worker protection. So it has to change the conversation. And I think ways that it could do that to begin without even regulation is have more performance-based guidance, on technology-specific applications, elevate compliance assistance in this area. Talk about what does this look like when you deploy these technologies? What are the best practices? Articulate safety outcomes. Talk about what is available for a particular risk, like struck by risk or heat stress, ergonomics. What are the solutions that are out there, and be engaged in terms of compliance assistance, guidance. And then I would say also be engaged in partnerships with various stakeholders, and be engaged in pilots, do more research. It's not typically something that OSHA does. NIOSH might have a seat in that, but they could convene stakeholders, all of these stakeholders, and kind of bring together a conversation to help this narrative to really build that foundation for innovation that stays true to OSHA's mission.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Let's stay on thinking about federal policy. Christina, you've done some work on kind of a balanced federal framework that is also evidence-based. Could you maybe add to Heather's point or talk a little bit about the evidence-based federal framework?
Well, yes, I'm happy to, although I know with time being a little bit limited for us, one of the things I would like to do is just kind of continue adding on to some of Heather's points, because she raised a lot of really good points about the components of good policy. I think it's important to also combine that with the people involved, because there are policy and evidence-based policy or good policy is really a combination of those that are setting vision and setting kind of the, in some ways, the floor to things, but also that there's a feedback loop around implementation. And the way, and what we mean by the implementation of a policy is that there are those, often we call them intermediaries, that represent classes of interest. So associations, unions can do this, other organizations that bring together the voices of those that are experiencing the impact of particular policies. And I think, especially in the near term, there's a really strong need, because what's occurring now is that these things are happening just at a proliferated effect across all of our states, and there isn't necessarily a unified voice right now in terms of the federal space. So it strikes me that those that are representing stakeholder groups and representing the different constituent interests at this time are really going to play a powerful role in helping to communicate some of those expectations and standards. So I'll just emphasize the importance of the players and the people involved in ensuring this, and to make sure that as we continue these conversations, that we revisit these different frameworks around balancing the innovation and risk, and data is key to that. So data is kind of the thing that's kind of the glue between the people, between the frameworks. And so to the extent that we continue to elevate the importance of how to ensure that data are benefiting and have transparency to all parties is really important.
Great. Thanks, Christina. We're almost out of time, but I want to allow Ashish and Tom to weigh in very briefly from a high level on two topics. So let's switch to kind of a lightning round. Ashish, do you have any ideas on more data on workplace technology adoption? And then Tom, go right to you, thinking about policy for more adoption of these technologies.
Yeah, I think it was already discussed, like these technology solutions, AI tools are only as good as like the data that they have been trained on or they have seen. So in that sense, more than like the sheer volume of it, I think the quality and the representativeness or heterogeneity of the data is more important. So one thing I wanted to quickly highlight, that if at a federal level or any kind of government level, if there is a way to foster like more teaming and collaboration of like academia, like different kinds of private sectors on like these collaborative projects that with like some degree of data sharing, or at least like allowing the technology solutions to be like built on all kinds of different types of data that it's likely gonna then be used on in practice. That can go a long way in making sure the solutions are actually meaningful and useful. So I'll emphasize like the quality and heterogeneity of data.
Yeah, a couple of bits from me. There was really some interesting initiatives started by OSHA, I think 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago. There was an awful lot of discussion about how to build standards around leading indicators. And I think the takeaway, unfortunately, was a lot of discussion about how businesses and industries are different, and therefore, settling for the simplest and easiest type of leading indicators, which might be tallying up the number of people who go to safety trainings every year, right? There's a distinct difference between that and seeing real-time information on hazards and trends and patterns, and mitigating those risks and communicating them. Every year, Liberty Mutual puts out the top 10 causes of workers' comp claims, which total something on the order of 60 to 80 billion dollars in direct and indirect costs every year in the U.S. alone. Of those top 10, there are a lot of those that can be prevented. Roadway incidents doesn't even break the top 5. And there are leading indicators and ways that data solutions done in a practical way can make an immediate impact on those things. So I would agree with Heather. Regulation and standards are the floor, they're not the ceiling. Organizations that are striving to do better and seeking tools, I think are leading the way. But communication of some of these issues and some of these realities, and there's an awful lot of confusion, I believe, when it comes to data privacy issues, which are very, very real. The confusion exists between protecting consumer privacy in data and a workplace's ability to gather data that has a meaningful impact on health and safety. And we have to engage in those conversations with prospective clients all the time that still don't have confidence in implementing a data gathering tool because they're worried about these issues.
Great. Thanks, Tom. We are a couple minutes over, so we will unfortunately have to end here, but hopefully this conversation can continue. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. Thank you very much to this great set of panelists for weighing in on this important topic. Please, be in touch with any of the panelists if you're interested to learn more. Please check out the report that I wrote on this. And yeah, thank you for a great discussion.
Thank you.